The march, April 11th, in the streets, diverts to the palace, the snipers placed on the buildings, the Chavez supporters on the bridge next to the palace, the shots fire at them first, they're hit from the chest up, start to go down, the opposition marchers as well, the firing between Caracas Metropolitan Police under the control of an opposition mayor at the time, Alfredo Peña, shooting with latex gloves, guns at the Chavez supporters on the bridge, also killing them firing back down. In Venezuela, just like here, I was told as well, and in the United States and other countries, we have corporate media, corporations that are media outlets that have licenses to operate on public airwaves, right? Because the airwaves belong to the public. So in Venezuela, there are 4 of these. There are 5 national broadcast channels. 4 are corporate media with licenses to operate on public airwaves. 1 is state. It's the state channel. So on that day, the corporate media, 2 of those stations in particular, take all these images from the streets, take them back to the studio, splice them up, make it look like, and then with a voiceover saying, look at those Chavez supporters firing on peaceful opposition marchers. They're killing them, making it look like the 2 marches, the concentrations that never were in the same place at all. One was behind the palace, the other was beside the palace, that the Chavez supporters were killing the opposition. You guys saw the film, so you know that. So Chavez disappears, taken prisoner. The plan plays out exactly as the CIA document pretty much says. And, before the dust is even settled on anything happening, the U.S. government is coming out. Well, actually, what happens? April 12th, the right man for the right time in Venezuela swears himself in as president, Pedro Carmona. Dissolves all the democratic institutions in the country, no more National Assembly, the Congress, despite the fact that the people elected their representatives, gone. No Attorney General, no more Supreme Court, rolling back to the Constitution of 1961. So what about that document that everybody drafted and worked on and ratified, and all their rights? Gone, right? Then the U.S. government, the representatives of the spokespeople for the White House State Department come out, read the statement saying, Chavez, we know what happened, that his supporters to fire on peaceful opposition marchers, causing the death and injury of more than 100 people. He's resigned, and we're now working with this transitional government. Like, what? We don't even know where Chavez is. What are you talking about? He never said anything. He's disappeared. The U.S. is already calling to just forget about everything that happened. Let's just work with this right man for the right time in Venezuela, right? The only country that does that in an official way. So the fabulous story about how Chavez is brought back to power by the people, by the unity of the loyal armed forces in Venezuela and the people of the country, bringing back their constitution and their president and their democracy. So after that, instead of cutting off the funding to those very undemocratic actors, the National Endowment for Democracy, which has as its mission, the actual mission that it was created for, is to promote democracy around the world. So instead of doing that, they've been funding cousters. You'd think they'd cut it off. They'd say, oops, we made a mistake. But actually that doesn't happen. 2 weeks after the coup, they actually give a special $1 million grant. The State Department gives the special $1 million grant to the National Endowment for Democracy for Venezuela projects, and they distribute it to the same groups that just executed the coup. So it was like saying, here's a little bit more for you guys, because obviously you didn't get the job done. A couple months later, another entity, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, known by many as a humanitarian aid fund, disaster aid relief, things like that. That's what it was supposedly established for by Kennedy. There's material that has to be approved by the United States or given by the United States for their projects or programs that they're supposedly conducting with that funding. They have to submit reports on their activities. I mean, it's a very much an ongoing relationship. And actually, this particular area, the financial front of attack, which increases after the coup, then helps fund the second stage of intervention. In the Chavez Code, I cover the first 3 stages of intervention: the coup, the economic sabotage at the end of that year, 2002, into February 2003, and then the recall referendum in 2004, August 2004. Bush versus Chavez picks up in 2005 up until the elections that just happened December 2006. First 3 stages of intervention. So that funding from USAID goes to contribute to the economic sabotage. It takes place December 2002, causing more than $10 billion in damages to Venezuela's economy. The opposition, how many of you know about that, the lockout, as it was called? Oh, good. All right. Well, anyway, during that period, very intense, 64 days, of economic sabotage. 18,000 workers from the oil industry walk off the job, sabotage the industry, bring it to a halt. High-level workers, managerial, running the IT operations. Psychological warfare. The 4 corporate media with licenses to operate on public airwaves turn over all their programming time to the opposition. No cartoons, no sitcoms, no telenovelas, soap operas, no nothing. It's Christmas time. People are forced off the job anyway. So kids are on vacation from school and workers can't work. They didn't voluntarily go on strike. They can't work. Psychological warfare imposed for 64 days, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was very intense. I was there for at least a month of that. So after that, third stage of intervention, more than $9 million go in from the United States funding to help the recall referendum campaign against Chavez. Recall referendum, article in Venezuela's constitution, any publicly elected official can be subject to a recall referendum after they meet the halfway point of their term. 20% of voters have to sign a petition saying we want a referendum. Then if they get that and the referendum happens, an equal or greater number that elect the president or the official have to vote to recall. So there are a lot of checks and balances on that. So this happens after a lot of, I recommend, if you don't know that story either, you read the Chavez Code. There was a lot of obstacles, plays all kinds of details, things that happened, sabotage, violence, all kinds of stuff. Chavez wins 60-40, landslide victory, wins the recall referendum. So after that, the U.S. government changes its strategy towards Venezuela. This is where this book starts, 2005. Condoleezza Rice, when she's in her confirmation hearing to become Secretary of State, makes a statement referring to Chavez as a negative force in the region. It's actually really important the moment that this takes place. She's not yet Secretary of State. This is a confirmation hearing. So what she says, what you say in that confirmation hearing before the Senate is basically laying out, this would be my plan. Here are my priorities. Here's what I think would be important. This is what I'm going to do as Secretary of State. So this concept, negative force in the region, is very important because it sets the stage for the relationship, for now becoming more hostile, aggressive, and openly so. Because before, coup, sabotage, electoral intervention, all this stuff taking place, 50 million U.S. taxpayer dollars going to aid all of that, help it out over those years. Really, Venezuela wasn't even a priority for the United States at all. Wasn't on any list. They were helping out their friends who were the ones that governed before, the political and economic elite, who had also had them pretty deceived, thinking they were the majority and they would be able to get Chavez out of power through one of those mechanisms. Doesn't happen. So the strategy shifts. Now, this financial front of attack I was referring to before actually increases, despite the fact that by now the Chavez Code is out and it's naming, and showing and talking about how all this mechanism is working. They actually increase the funding, in fact, and the amount of groups receiving it. It doubles. It's doubled today, doubled the funding. And the number of groups, for example, in that time period, even the time period of the referendum, there were about 64 groups receiving, 60-some groups receiving, or projects, programs receiving funding from the U.S. government through USAID or National Endowment for Democracy. Today it's over 300. Okay? This is really substantial. And of course, now the net is much wider. It's not just National Endowment for Democracy and USAID. There are all these other new institutions that are funded by the U.S. government, like Freedom House and Albert Einstein Institution and International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, with all these very nice-sounding names that are conducting this work and that are filtering the funding even further, making it more difficult to decipher. Some of the documents that originally we got, these contracts and things, had the names censored of the groups that they fund. Right? But they left the projects and things like that, project names, and so it was easy to figure out who a lot of them were. So we went through this process of appeals, administrative appeals, and got actually into the D.C. Circuit Court, Washington, D.C. because they kept denying our appeals, so we take them to court, USAID. Just a couple weeks ago, after a year of motions back and forth, we lost the case. Judicial decision came down. The USAID had claimed they were protecting the personal privacy rights of individuals working for the groups that receive the funding. But we weren't asking for I didn't want names of anybody. I want names of groups, right? So organizations don't have privacy rights. That doesn't exist. But their argument was, which in fact the judge's decision said, the law is on your side. The law is on my side. However, we're accepting the government's argument. Of course, they're the government too. I mean, it's the D.C. Circuit Court. But they say because, one, they accept the argument that the groups that are funded are so small, 2 to 3 people receiving $50,000, $100,000, that if their names would be disclosed of the organization, everyone would know who the individuals are working for them, and therefore, according to the argument they accepted of the State Department, they would be tortured and persecuted in Venezuela, which is not true. No evidence was presented for that except their own testimonies of just based on future. However, there was something really important, and especially for you guys who also do this work. The judicial decision actually said, citing law, that entities, grantees of agencies of the United States, so that can mean through USAID, through National Endowment for Democracy, through Freedom House, through any that receive this funding, are considered employees and agents of the United States government, and therefore will be treated as though they were like federal government employees with full protection of the law. I mean, that now applies to probably thousands of groups and tens of thousands of individuals working for them who probably don't even know that they are agents of the United States government. And it's a pretty scary thought. So this is an area of great concern, because to think that all these entities are operating now more in Venezuela, obviously they're beyond, the opposition has dwindled in terms of its support. So we know that a lot of them are working, for example, in poorer neighborhoods, areas that support Chavez and the revolution, that are working in community councils, even in the efforts to build the new political unified party. So there's a lot of penetration and infiltration going on, and sabotage, and provoking divisions, and trying to foster, counter revolutionary ideas. The second major front of attack that I mentioned with this discourse of negative force in the region, I call the diplomatic front of attack. So this is, the area where the U.S. government and its collaborators are using the international arena, diplomacy as well as media, to try to isolate Venezuela and demonize Chavez. So all that stuff you guys were, some of you were talking about in the beginning, what you see in the media, the dictator, the populace, repression of rights or whatever, this is part of a very coordinated strategy. That's why I asked those questions. Well, one, to get a feel for your knowledge base, but also because every single place says the same thing. That's because it's a coordinated media strategy. So negative force in January 2005 quickly becomes destabilizing force, dangerous force or state or government associated with terrorism. Talk about hypocrisy, referring back to Luis Posar Carriles, that Venezuela has been trying to extradite a self-confessed terrorist with a pending trial, fugitive from justice for 2 years, now free in Miami drinking mojitos with Carlos Andres Perez and who knows who else, Orlando Bosch and the rest of them. Venezuela was labeled for the second year in a row, again just 2 weeks ago, by the State Department as a country not fully collaborating with the war on terror. But it's been trying to extradite a terrorist for 2 years, from this country. But that is very dangerous. It can include Venezuela then in the framework of the war on terror. And also a sanction was imposed on Venezuela, a prohibition of buying arms, weapons from the United States or countries that manufacture those items with parts from the United States. So for example, Venezuela is also sanctioned now 3 years in a row, this also just coming down again, for being a country not fully complicit with counter-narcotics efforts. Actually, I don't think they use the fully term in that. Not complicit with counter-narcotics efforts. In fact, the latest report that came out actually says Venezuela is #1 for drug transit in the world. Not true. I mean, the statistics actually show the opposite, right? In fact, the reason that they made this classification in the beginning was in 2005, is because substantial evidence had been acquired by Venezuela's anti-drug command teams and security forces that actually the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States, the DEA, was sabotaging counter-narcotics efforts in Venezuela. And then a lot of that evidence actually I have in Bush versus Chavez. And so when Venezuela suspends, what happens is Chavez suspends the relationship with the DEA. Says, you're sabotaging our counter-narcotics efforts. We're suspending this relationship. The efforts improve in Venezuela, but of course then the U.S. says, well, if you're not working with us, then you're complicit with drug trafficking. That's because they want to keep working in Venezuela. And they're going at it again. What's ironic is, that the sanction imposed, for example, on the weapons purchase, Venezuela had made a contract with Brazil to buy these airplanes, the Super Tucanes, which are for monitoring drug trafficking activity, to be able to control it better. But they actually have parts in them that are made by a U.S., war military industrial corporation, right, from the military industrial complex. So Brazil had to break the contract with Venezuela because of the sanction imposed by the United States. So now they can't get the planes for monitoring the drug trafficking, and then the U.S. is classifying them as not complicit with counter-narcotics efforts. I mean, now Venezuela has found other partners to get, its needed equipment for defense and security. But this is very scary, that Venezuela is now being classified in this way for now 2 years in a row in terms of including it in the framework of the war on terror, especially because there's a government in the United States that can use that as an excuse for preemptive action at any time in any way that it pleases. We've seen it happen already in Iraq, and plans for it to happen also in Iran. And who knows where else. Could be Venezuela next, closer.